March 28, 1942. Saint-Nazaire, occupied France. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Loire estuary, an aging American destroyer painted an unusual shade of pink careened toward steel dock gates at ramming speed. Inside her reinforced bow, 5 tons of explosives waited in silence. On her decks and in motor launches trailing behind, 612 men prepared for what their commanders had called a suicide mission with strategic importance. Most would never see England again. But before the sun rose on that March morning, they would change the course of World War II. This is the story of Operation Chariot, the raid Winston Churchill himself would later call the greatest of all time. To understand why the British were willing to sacrifice hundreds of men for a single dock, you must first understand the terror that haunted the Royal Navy in early 1942. The battleship Tirpitz. Sister ship to the legendary Bismarck, the Tirpitz represented Germany's ultimate maritime threat to Allied operations. After Bismarck's destruction in May 1941, the Germans kept Tirpitz lurking in Norwegian fjords like a predator waiting to strike. The mere possibility of her sortie into the Atlantic forced the Royal Navy to maintain enormous battle groups, ships desperately needed elsewhere, on constant alert. The mathematics were brutal. One German battleship was tying down a significant portion of Britain's naval strength. Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, understood that Tirpitz did not even need to fight to win. She just needed to exist as a threat. But there was one vulnerability in this strategic equation. If Tirpitz were damaged in Atlantic operations, she would need a dry dock large enough to accommodate her massive 42,900-ton displacement for repairs. On the entire Atlantic coast of occupied Europe, only one such facility existed, the Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire. Built before the war to service the magnificent French ocean liner Normandy, the dock was a masterpiece of engineering. It was 1,148 feet long, 164 feet wide, and capable of lifting vessels weighing up to 50,000 tons. For the German Kriegsmarine, it was an insurance policy. For the British, it was a target. Churchill's logic was coldly pragmatic. As one senior officer recalled him saying, "I am prepared to lose a warship and 500 men if it stops the Tirpitz. Remove the dock, and you remove Tirpitz's safety net. Remove the safety net, and you drastically reduce the likelihood Germany would risk deploying her into the open Atlantic." The stakes were existential. If Tirpitz successfully raided Allied convoys, particularly those supplying the Soviet Union via the Murmansk Run, the balance of the war could shift dramatically. In the summer of 1942, convoy PQ-17 would be scattered by the mere rumor of Tirpitz's approach, resulting in the loss of 24 merchant ships and their vital cargo. The solution was as audacious as it was desperate. A small force of commandos and sailors would penetrate one of the most heavily defended ports in occupied Europe and destroy the dock from within. It was the kind of plan that looked insane on paper. That is precisely why it might work. In early 1942, the Combined Operations Headquarters began studying options for neutralizing Saint-Nazaire. The port bristled with coastal artillery, anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and thousands of German troops. Conventional assault was impossible. Bombing from the air would require sustained raids that might take weeks and kill thousands of French civilians. The answer came from Captain John Hughes Hallett and his planning staff. They would turn a warship into a guided missile. The concept was elegantly simple and horrifyingly dangerous. An old destroyer, packed with explosives, would be disguised as a German vessel and sail directly into the harbor under cover of darkness. She would ram the dock gates at full speed, embedding herself in the structure. Commandos aboard would disembark and destroy auxiliary targets, pumping stations, lock mechanisms, power facilities, while the ship's delayed action fuses counted down. Hours later, when German forces had relaxed and were inspecting the captured British destroyer, 5 tons of high explosives would detonate, destroying the dock and everyone near it. Approval for Operation Chariot came on March 3, 1942, giving planners just 25 days to prepare. Lord Louis Mountbatten, head of Combined Operations, selected Commander Robert Ryder to lead the naval force and Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman to command the commandos. For the suicide ship, they chose HMS Campbelltown, formerly USS Buchanan, a World War I-era destroyer transferred to Britain under the Lend-Lease program. She was old, slow, and expendable. Perfect for a one-way trip. Over 9 frantic days in Devonport, shipyard workers transformed Campbelltown from a tired destroyer into a floating time bomb. First, they lightened her to reduce draft for navigating the shallow Loire estuary. 2 of her 4 funnels were removed, and the remaining 2 were cut down and angled to resemble those of a German Moe-class torpedo boat. From a distance, and in the dark, the deception might buy them precious minutes. The real work happened in her bow. Engineers welded 24 Mark VII depth charges, each containing roughly 400 pounds of high explosive, into a single mass encased in steel and concrete, creating approximately 5 tons of explosive power. The casing served dual purposes. It prevented the explosive from deforming on impact, and it disguised the deadly cargo as structural reinforcement. The detonation mechanism was both clever and terrifying. Pencil fuses, glass tubes filled with acid that would slowly eat through a metal wire, would trigger the explosion hours after impact. The calculated delay was 8 hours, giving commandos time to complete their missions and, theoretically, escape. As one engineer involved in the conversion later noted, the margin for error was razor thin. If the fuses activated too early, the ship would explode before reaching the target. Too late, and German engineers might discover and disable them. Campbelltown was painted an unusual shade, the Royal Navy called Plymouth Pink, a light color that blended into haze and made the ship harder to see in searchlight beams. It was an innovation developed by Mountbatten himself for night operations. In the destroyer's wardroom, away from crew eyes, another modification was made: a manual detonator. If the operation failed and Germans attempted to capture Campbelltown intact, her commander had orders to trigger the explosives by hand. On the morning of March 26, 1942, Campbelltown was ready. She would never return. The commandos selected for Operation Chariot came primarily from No. 2 Commando, reinforced by detachments from other units. They were volunteers, men who had already volunteered once just to join the commandos, and who now volunteered again for a mission their officers described, with unusual candor, as extremely hazardous. The training regimen for British Commandos was legendary in its brutality. Candidates endured forced marches carrying 70-pound packs, close-quarters combat drills, cliff climbing, demolitions work, and navigation exercises in complete darkness. The attrition rate was severe. Those who survived emerged as perhaps the most elite light infantry force of the war. For Operation Chariot, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman selected 256 commandos organized into specialized assault and demolition teams. Some carried only pistols and rucksacks containing up to 90 pounds of plastic explosives. Others, armed with Thompson submachine guns and Bren light machine guns, would provide covering fire. Before departure, Newman addressed his men with uncommon honesty. According to multiple accounts, he told them, "Lads, nobody is forcing you to do this. If you want out, speak now with no shame." Silence. Then, as one veteran recalled, someone started clapping. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause and song. They knew Of course they knew. The escape plan depended on motor launches returning to pick them up after the operation, small wooden boats trying to extract hundreds of men from a fully alerted German garrison. The math did not work. But they went anyway. Among those who volunteered was a young lieutenant named Bob Burtonshaw, known for his habit of wearing a monocle even in combat, an affectation that would become legendary in the hours ahead. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on March 26, 1942, the strike force departed Falmouth. The flotilla consisted of HMS Campbelltown, 2 Hunt-class escort destroyers named Atherstone and Tynedale, motor gunboat 314, motor torpedo boat 74, and 16 motor launches carrying commandos. Beneath the waves, submarine HMS Sturgeon would position herself as a navigation beacon. The weather favored them, overcast skies and moderate seas. But as they crossed the channel, tension mounted. German U-boats and patrol aircraft could spot them at any moment. That near disaster came on the afternoon of March 27th, when U-593 detected the British flotilla. Her captain radioed headquarters. A British naval force was heading south. Fortunately for Operation Chariot, he misjudged their course, reporting they were likely bound for Gibraltar or North Africa rather than Saint-Nazaire. The incorrect intelligence may have saved the mission before it began. As darkness fell on March 27th, the commandos made final preparations. Faces were blackened with cork char. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Men wrote letters they knew might be their last, though regulations forbade mentioning anything about the operation. Aboard Campbelltown, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, the destroyer's captain, studied his charts one final time. He would need to navigate the shallow, winding Loire estuary in darkness, under fire, and ram the dock gates at precisely the right angle and speed. Too slow, and the bow would not embed properly. Too fast, and the ship might break apart. At midnight, they saw the first signs of Saint-Nazaire, flashes in the sky as RAF bombers began their diversionary raid. 65 RAF bombers had been assigned to attack Saint-Nazaire that night, creating confusion and masking the sound of approaching naval vessels. But Churchill, deeply concerned about French civilian casualties, had imposed severe restrictions. Crews could only bomb if they could visually identify military targets. The result was chaos. Some crews, unable to see clearly through cloud cover, dropped single bombs or no bombs at all. Others made repeated passes trying to acquire targets, creating unusual flight patterns. In his command bunker, the German garrison commander, Captain Karl Konrad Mecke, noticed immediately. This was not normal bombing behavior. The scattered, tentative approach suggested something else, perhaps a parachute drop or commando raid. Mecke ordered increased vigilance. He did not know it yet, but his instinct was correct. Unfortunately for him, he assumed any attack would come from the air, not the sea. As the last RAF bombers departed and relative quiet returned, 16 motor launches and 1 elderly destroyer slipped past the outer harbor defenses and into the Loire estuary. The British were inside. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the flotilla was 5 miles from the dock. They flew German naval ensigns and responded to challenges with German signal codes obtained by British intelligence. For agonizing minutes, the deception held. Then, at 1:20 in the morning, the leading boats were caught by searchlights from both banks of the river. A German signal station flashed a challenge. On MGB 314, a fluent German-speaking officer replied with the recognition codes. For a moment, the Germans seemed satisfied. Then another challenge came, more insistent. The game was up. German coastal batteries and anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The Loire estuary erupted into a maelstrom of tracers, shells, and searchlight beams. Commander Ryder gave the order, strike the German colors and hoist the white ensign. The British were no longer pretending. Campbelltown surged forward at maximum speed, 18 knots, everything her aging engines could produce. Around her, the motor launches disintegrated under German fire. ML-192 burst into flames. ML-262 took a direct hit and exploded. Men who jumped into the oil-slicked water were cut down by machine gun fire. On Campbelltown's bridge, shell impacts killed both helmsmen. Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz, the explosives officer, grabbed the wheel himself and held the course. Beside him, Commander Beatty stood calmly, making minor course corrections as shells screamed overhead. A survivor later recalled, "The weight of fire took one's breath away. The ship's sides seemed alive with bursting shells." Campbelltown's forward gun, manned by able seaman William Savage, continued firing even as the gunner's position was repeatedly hit. Savage would be killed at his post, still firing, minutes before the ship reached its target. He would posthumously receive the Victoria Cross. Through burning boats and screaming shells, Campbelltown charged towards the Normandy dock gates. At 1:34 in the morning on March 28, 1942, HMS Campbelltown struck the center of the dock gates at nearly 20 knots. The impact drove her bow 36 feet into the gate structure, crumpling steel and concrete, but holding firm. The ship was now wedged into the dock entrance like a dagger thrust into the heart of the enemy. Commander Beatty, surveying the smoking wreckage from the bridge, famously remarked, "Well, there we are, 4 minutes late." It was perhaps the most British understatement of the entire war. They had just completed a suicide ramming attack against impossible odds, and Beatty's concern was punctuality. Below decks, Lieutenant Tirpitz checked the time delay fuses. They were ticking. Everything was proceeding as planned. The ship was in position. The countdown had begun. Commandos scrambled down ropes and ladders onto the dock, immediately engaging German defenders. Behind them, Campbelltown burned, her upper works riddled with shell holes but her deadly cargo intact and invisible beneath twisted steel. The commando teams moved with practiced precision despite the chaos. Each group had specific objectives, rehearsed in mock-ups built at British training facilities. Lieutenant John Roderick's assault party charged German gun emplacements, destroying them with grenades. A flak tower fell next, then a 40mm gun position. Behind them, demolition teams rushed toward the massive pumping station that controlled the dock's water level. Lieutenant Stuart Chant, despite being wounded in both arm and leg, led his team into the pumping station. They descended 40 feet underground to the machinery level, where they planted charges on the enormous pumps. When those charges detonated, the explosion dropped the motors into a crater and reduced the control systems to rubble. Even if the gates were somehow repaired, the dock would be unable to fill or drain. Meanwhile, Captain Donald Roy led a party of Scots commandos toward the northern end of the complex. According to accounts, Roy's men scaled buildings using rope ladders, cleared rooftops with grenades, and fought with bayonets when ammunition ran low. One of the most remarkable figures that night was Lieutenant Bob Burtonshaw. Severely wounded in both legs and barely able to stand, he nevertheless insisted on leading his demolition team to their objective. Witnesses reported that he wore his trademark monocle throughout the action and hummed, "There'll always be an England," while setting explosive charges. Burtonshaw would be killed completing his mission, but his explosives successfully destroyed part of the dock's caisson system. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the primary demolition objectives had been achieved. The pump house was destroyed, lock gates were damaged, German defensive positions had been neutralized. Against all odds, the operation was succeeding. But there was one catastrophic problem. The escape plan was disintegrating. The motor launches were supposed to evacuate the commandos after completing their objectives. But of the 16 that entered the harbor, most had been sunk or severely damaged during the approach. The survivors were desperately overloaded with wounded and could barely make headway against the current. At the designated evacuation point, the Old Mole, German fire made approach nearly impossible. Of the few boats that reached the pier, several were hit and set ablaze while men were boarding. Commander Ryder, surveying the carnage from MGB 314, faced an agonizing decision. He could keep trying to extract men and likely lose every remaining vessel, or he could save those he had already rescued and withdraw while some escape was still possible. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, Ryder ordered the surviving boats to retreat. For the commandos still ashore, there would be no Royal Navy pickup. Lieutenant Colonel Newman gathered his remaining men and issued 3 orders that would become legendary in commando history. 1. Do your best to get back to England. 2. Don't surrender till all ammunition is gone. 3. Don't surrender at all if you can help it. Then Newman led his commandos inland, attempting to fight through Saint-Nazaire and reach open country. For the next 3 hours, small groups of British commandos fought running battles through the streets of Saint-Nazaire. German reinforcements poured in from nearby garrisons, outnumbering the raiders by increasingly absurd ratios. Some commandos hid in buildings, ambushing German patrols. Others attempted to reach the countryside beyond the town. A few tried to disappear into the French population, hoping the resistance would shelter them. Lieutenant Chant's party, blocked by a fire-swept bridge, swung hand over hand along the girders underneath to reach the other side. Other groups were less fortunate, caught in ambushes or simply overwhelmed by numbers. By dawn, ammunition was exhausted. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, Newman and the largest remaining group of commandos were surrounded. With no ammunition left and further resistance pointless, Newman ordered his men to surrender. German officers, according to multiple accounts, treated the captured commandos with respect. One reportedly said, "You fought bravely. I have the honor to accept your surrender, sir. Of the 612 men who entered Saint-Nazaire harbor, only 228 would return to Britain. The rest were dead or captured. But their mission was not yet complete. By mid-morning on March 28th, the battle was over. Campbelltown sat motionless in the dock gates, her upper decks a burned-out wreck. German officers began inspecting the prize, curious about the old destroyer that had caused so much trouble. According to German records, approximately 40 senior German officers and engineers were aboard or near Campbelltown at mid-morning, assessing damage and discussing salvage options. Dozens of soldiers and sailors wandered the ship, searching for souvenirs, chocolate, cigarettes, alcohol, anything valuable from the British vessel. Commander Beatty, captured and undergoing interrogation, reportedly remained calm. German officers asked him technical questions about the destroyer. According to legend, though historians debate the exact details, Beatty was still being questioned when it happened. At 10:35 in the morning, 5 tons of high explosives detonated. The explosion was cataclysmic. Campbelltown's entire bow section disintegrated. The dock gates, already weakened by the ramming, shattered. A massive surge of water swept through the dock, carrying debris and bodies. The blast was heard for miles. Between 150 and 360 Germans were killed instantly. Sources vary, but the carnage was undeniable. Among the dead were many of those senior officers who had been inspecting the ship, confident the danger had passed. The Normandy dock was destroyed. Mission accomplished. Whether Beatty actually delivered a final quip to his interrogators, "We are not quite as foolish as you thought," remains disputed by historians. But the sentiment was undeniably accurate. The British had done exactly what they had come to do, and the Germans had walked directly into the trap. the nightmare for the Germans was not over. 2 days later, on March 30th, 2 delayed action torpedoes fired by MTB-74 during the withdrawal finally detonated, damaging the old entrance to the Saint-Nazaire basin. The Germans, already traumatized by the Campbelltown explosion, panicked. Workers from the organization Todt, the German construction group, fled the docks. German sentries, terrified of British commandos and expecting further attacks, opened fire on anything that moved. In the confusion, they killed approximately 20 to 30 of their own construction workers. The port was evacuated and remained closed for several days while German engineers searched for additional booby traps and delayed explosives. Tirpitz's Atlantic insurance policy had been comprehensively destroyed. The human cost of Operation Chariot was staggering. British losses were 169 killed and 215 captured. 228 returned to Britain, and 5 eventually escaped captivity and made it home via Spain. German losses included between 150 and 360 killed, primarily in the Campbelltown explosion. The Normandy dock was not fully repaired until 1947. For their actions, participants in Operation Chariot received 89 decorations, including an unprecedented 5 Victoria Crosses, more than any other single operation in World War II. Commander Robert Ryder, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, able seaman William Savage, and Sergeant Thomas Durant were all awarded the highest honor. Savage and Durant received theirs posthumously. The raid achieved its strategic objective with brutal efficiency. Tirpitz never deployed into the Atlantic. Without a safe haven for repairs, the German Navy kept her in Norwegian waters, where she served primarily as a fleet in being, a threat that tied down Allied resources but never achieved the decisive impact Germany needed. The psychological effect on German leadership was profound. Adolf Hitler, enraged that a British flotilla had penetrated a heavily defended port, sacked the Chief of Staff to O.B. West and ordered a massive reinforcement of the Atlantic Wall. Enormous quantities of concrete and labor, resources desperately needed elsewhere, were diverted to strengthening coastal defenses. Churchill, addressing Parliament, called it a brilliant and heroic exploit. Privately, he expressed the cold calculation that had driven the operation. One raid, costing 400 casualties, had neutralized a strategic threat that might otherwise have cost thousands of lives and critical war material. For the French resistance, Operation Chariot provided a powerful morale boost. The British had struck deep into occupied France and achieved their objective. The Germans were not invincible. Resistance activity increased in the months following the raid. Some of the participants in Operation Chariot survived the war and lived long enough to see their action recognized. Commander Beatty, held in a German POW camp for the remainder of the war, returned to Britain and worked with the Lizard lifeboat station in Cornwall, saving lives for decades. He died in 1975, having never sought glory for his wartime service. Lieutenant Colonel Newman also survived captivity and returned to civilian engineering work after the war. He rarely spoke of Saint-Nazaire, though he attended veteran reunions and memorial services. He died in 1972. 5 men managed to evade capture and eventually reached neutral Spain by crossing the Pyrenees with help from the French resistance. Their journey took weeks of hiding, traveling at night, and relying on underground networks that risked death to shelter Allied servicemen. Each of these escapes was its own epic of endurance. In Saint-Nazaire today, memorials honor both the British raiders and the French civilians who died during the battle. The Normandy dock, fully repaired after the war, still operates. A plaque marks where HMS Campbelltown struck the gates, and every March 28th, veterans and descendants gather to remember the night when 612 men sailed into hell because the mission demanded it. Military historian Robert Jackson called Operation Chariot the greatest raid of all, a phrase that has become the operation's unofficial epithet. What made it greatest was not the scale. The D-Day landings were far larger, but rather the ratio of risk to strategic value. 600 men, in an operation given less than a 50% chance of success, neutralized a threat that had been paralyzing Allied naval strategy. They did it with ingenuity, desperate courage, and an acceptance of casualties that would be unthinkable in modern military planning. Modern Special Operations Forces study Operation Chariot for its planning, deception elements, and combined arms coordination. But what truly sets it apart is the human dimension. Men who went forward knowing they almost certainly would not return because someone needed to do it, and they were willing. In the final analysis, Operation Chariot was a trade. British lives for strategic advantage. Commander Ryder, reflecting years later, said it most clearly. "We went because Tirpitz was a dagger pointed at the heart of our convoys. We removed that dagger. The price was high, but the alternative was unthinkable." 4 minutes late, 5 Victoria Crosses, 1 destroyed dock, and a battleship that never sailed into the Atlantic.